Hi, and welcome to this 3D Studio Max training video. My name is Gavin. A lot of you may know me as Gavin B off of CG Talk. And what we're going to do today is just cover some of the basics of maxscript. We'll look at where to find it, look at the layout of it, and then we'll just go through and create a simple script. And as we go through the simple script, we'll just have a look what each section is doing and why. And hopefully that will give you a better understanding of Max and help you use it a lot more. Now the first place to find maxscript, and one of the two places that we're going to be looking at today, is down here in the status bar. You have the command line input and you have the maxscript listener. The command line input from maxscript will basically just let you type in a command and hit return or enter, and it will execute that for you. So for instance, if we come in here and type sphere, hit return, you'll see that we get a new sphere here in the viewport. In the listener window, you'll notice this string of text and numbers come up. What that's doing is basically just saying that it's created a sphere object. It's called it sphere 01, and it's put it at 0, 0, and then 0 again in the X, Y, and Z axes. Let's get rid of that for a second and clear these two out. What you can also use this for is just basically mathematical equations. So we could type in there 10 plus 10 plus 10 plus 10, hit return, and we'll get 40. Another useful feature is, as you go through and execute more and more commands in there, it will actually build up a list, and you can right click in the top one of the two and it will actually give you the most recently run commands, and you can just select one of those out of the list. So we can come in here and just select we'll select the mathematical one, and it will automatically put the results back in there for you. The second place that we're going to look at maxscript is up here on the toolbar. If you select the option for maxscript, you'll see that you get new script, open script, run script, maxscript listener, and macro recorder, and these are the ones that we're going to be taking a look at today. Now the first one, new script. If you select that, you'll see you'll just be presented with a basic maxscript input window. Just plain, and to be quite honest, uninteresting to look at. The next one is the open script command. You just select that, it will let you browse your hard drive, and from the hard drive it will let you pick any script that's been created previously and open it up. So we'll just open up the one here that we're going to be creating later. Okay. Run script does exactly that. It will let you browse your hard drive, find a script. So let's have a look at we'll put the mosaic effect one, and you'll see that nothing actually happens. What it's actually done is gone through, executed all the commands in that script, but doesn't actually display anything. However, if we go to rendering, effects, and add, you'll see a new mosaic option under there, which is the script that we've just run. The next one is the maxscript listener, which is just the same as the command line down the bottom, except it actually gives you a full pane window to actually look at. And here you can see previous commands that have been run. If we just clear that all, and you can do it pretty much the way that you did down the bottom. So if we do sphere again, you'll see the sphere created down here in the viewport, and you'll see this command return back to us, the object type sphere, called sphere 01 at 0, 0 and 0 in the X, Y and Z. Just clear all of that out. Okay, the other option that we're going to take a look at in a little while is the macro recorder, and as I say, we'll come to that in a minute. So if we just go back to new script, you can just see that it, for all intents and purposes, just looks like a Windows text editor such as Notepad. The major difference is, under File, you have this option for Evaluate All. What Evaluate All does is basically goes through any text that you've typed in within the maxscript editor, and it will execute it command line by command line. And you'll obviously see the results in the viewport, and you'll also get the results back in the maxscript listener if you have that open. Another major difference of the maxscript editor from a normal text editor is that it will actually highlight text for you. Syntax highlighting it's called. And what syntax highlighting does is, for instance, reserved words, it will change their colour. So if you have a reserved word of max such as if, it will come out blue. If it's just a normal word such as sphere, it'll come out black. If it's a comment, it will come out green. And if it's that we're specifying a string of text, it will come out, well, we need to do it on a separate line because it's now in the comments, it will come out in a kind of burgundy red colour. Now the reason that we got the green up there is because everything after this double minus sign here will be classed as a comment, And comments are basically just bits of text that you can write for yourself, and they will be ignored by the maxscript editor as it goes through step by step and executes your script. Just get rid of that. Okay, so as I said, we're going to go through and create a simple script. Now what this script does is basically just brings up a dialog box with some options in it, and lets you go through and specify some values to create objects. So we'll just have to take a look at that script quickly now before we go through and actually create it. So if we just open up sample, evaluate all, you'll see we get this window called make objects. It gives us two options of a box or sphere, so it will let us make a box or sphere. It lets us specify how far each object that we create will be away from each other and the amount of objects. So just close that window down there for a second and minimize this one. If we do 50 units of boxes, and we'll do 20 objects in total, so we'll have 20 boxes 50 units apart. Make and zoom out, you'll see that we've got all the objects that we've just created using that script. Okay, so that's the script that we're just going to go through and create now. So we'll start off with just a blank maxscript window. The first thing that we want to go through and do is actually just create the dialog box itself. Now to do that, we have a reserved word in Max called rollout. What rollout does basically is tells it that we're going to create a new window. What we then need to do is give this window an internal name, something that we can refer to later on in the script if we need to adjust anything on it. So we'll just call this my win. Okay, so later on when we want to refer to the window and tell 3D Studio Max to do something with it, we refer to my win. What we then need to do is give it the label at the top, and we'll just call it make objects. Okay, so you can see that we've used these speech marks here to actually specify a string of text to tell 3D Studio Max to put that as the label at the top of the window. What we then need to do is tell 3D Studio Max that everything that comes after this, up until a certain point, will be something that we want to do with this window. Now the way that we do that is with brackets. So we'll open a bracket and close a bracket. So everything between these two brackets will be part of the rollout, part of this dialog box. Anything that comes after it will be executed separately. What we then need to do is go through and actually create the controls within that window. Now the first thing that you saw within that window was radio buttons. The radio buttons are literally just labels. So as you saw, we had box and sphere as the labels, with a little circle box that you can tick next to it, and as you tick one, the other one unticks itself. So the command for that within 3D Studio Max is just radio buttons. We'll open bracket type. What we then need to do, like we did with the rollout, is give it an internal name in case we need to refer to it back to it later. So we'll just call it rad buttons. The next thing that we then need to do is give it the labels. To do that, we use the parameter labels. Now if you ever need to find out what any of the parameters are, such as labels for an object, you can highlight it all and press F1, and it will bring up the 3D Studio Max maxscript reference guide. And you'll see here you have radio buttons, then the name, and then the captions. Now here are the parameters you have: labels, default, and columns. Okay. Now what these parameters are: labels gives it an array of strings. An array basically is just one object that one variable that contains many other constants. As such, a variable is an object that you can specify yourself that can change. You can change the value within it. A constant is something that once it's set will stay set. So we have labels, which is an array of strings that specifies a number of radio buttons and the text label for each. Default tells it which one to set as default. So if we had 3 objects, we could set number 2 as default. So the second one would be automatically highlighted when it's created. And columns is so you can have rows of these radio buttons going across, but you can also have them listed downwards as well. So what we need to do is put a hash to tell it that we're doing an array open brackets to tell it that we're starting the array, and then give it the strings to tell it what labels to print. So we want box and sphere. We then close the bracket to tell it that the array has ended. The next object that we saw was called a spinner, which is like a numerical input with little arrows next to it, so we can just slide it up and down basically. We then need to give it an internal name. Again, we'll do that xdist, just because we're using this spinner to specify a distance in the x direction that the objects will be apart from each other. We then need to give it a label, so we'll call it distance apart. The next parameter that we need to specify is called range, and what range does is it tells it a minimum, a maximum and default value. Okay, now the reason that we put these colons in here and here is because we're specifying a parameter name. What we then need to tell 3D Studio Max is the actual value, and the way that we do that is with these colons. The colon tells it that whatever comes immediately after will be the value. So we then open the square brackets because these are actually already specified the amount of objects within this array. You have three. You have the minimum value, the maximum value and the default value. So for the distance apart, we'll set a minimum value of 0, a maximum value of 200 and a default value of 50. We then close the square braces to tell it that we've actually finished inputting into that array. Again, we then had another spinner object. So again, we just type spinner to tell 3D Studio Max we want to create a spinner. We're going to call this one clones because it was specifying how many clones of that object that we want to make. We then have the label. We'll call it amount. We then need the range. So for this one, we'll do minimum 0, maximum 20, and a default of 1. Then close the braces. The last object that was actually in there was a button. Now the keyword in Max for that is simply button. We then need to give it its internal name, so we'll call it make obj for make object, and we'll give it a label of make. So all this is doing is telling it we want to create a button with an internal name of make object and with a label of make. Okay, so that's now the actual dialog box and all of its controls. What we then need to do is tell 3D Studio Max to actually display it. To do that, we have to type a command outside of this closed bracket, so it's outside of actually creating the window itself. And that command that we then need to type is create dialog. Now that'll tell it that we're going to create a dialog box, and 3D Studio Max will obviously want to know what dialog box, so we need to give it this internal name. We're telling it that we want to create dialog mywim. What we can then do is specify a width, so we'll give it the dialog box a width of 200, and you'll notice again we're using these colons just to tell it that the value that comes immediately after is the actual value for that parameter, and we'll give it a height of 100. Okay, so we're telling 3D Studio Max to create a dialog. The dialog we want to create is mywin, which is specified up here. We want to give it a width of 200 and a height of 100. Now what this would do is make that dialog box with these dimensions, but also include all of these controls. Now just to test it at this point, if we go File, Evaluate All, there you go. Now there's one part of that script I've left out purposely just to show you, and that's obviously these radio buttons work fine. You can see that we select one and it deselects the other. This works fine. We can specify a minimum maximum value between 0 and 200. The only one that's slightly out is the amount, because it has this point and then a decimal place after. Now obviously we cannot create 1.6 or 1.5 objects. So what we need to do is tell 3D Studio Max only to show whole numbers, only to show integers. An integer basically is a whole number, it has no decimal places. A number with a decimal place is called a float. So if we just close that down, we need to tell 3D Studio Max that this one here, the clones, can only display whole numbers. Now the way that we do that is we put the parameter name type, a colon, and then tell it that we only want to create integer numbers within that box. So we tell it literally straight away in the parameters integer. So if we file evaluate all, you'll notice now the decimal place has gone and we can only display whole numbers. Okay, so that's the dialog box created. What we then need to do is obviously go through and actually create all of the objects specified by these options up here. Now to do that, we can actually do that within the actual rollout itself. Within this piece of this code block here, we can actually give it the commands to actually tell it what to do. So we'll just give it a couple of spaces between the actual creation of the objects and the start of the actual code that processes this. Now what we need to do is tell 3D Studio Max that when we click this button make OBJ, when we press it basically, to do a certain set of commands. Now it really is that simple. We literally tell 3D Studio Max that on make OBJ pressed do, and then tell it what block of code. So all that does is, on the event that this button is pressed, do this block of code. And it really is that simple. Now what we're going to do in this script is, because we're specifying a distance between each object, so we need to move each object along the x plane, the x direction by this amount, we need to create a temporary variable. A variable, as I've said before, is a number, an actual number or string or float or anything else that can be changed on the fly by yourself or by the script. Now what we're going to do is create a variable called x offset, and we're going to give it an initial value of 0. So we're saying that we've created a temporary variable and we're assigning it the value 0. Equals literally just means this variable is equal to this number, so we could specify any number there. Okay, now what we're going to do with this variable is, as the script goes through and creates one box, it will then add the distance to this variable. So over time this variable will increase. It'll start off at 0, and then if we left this at its default value of 50, after it's created the first box at 0, it would go through and put 50. It will then go through and add another 50 to make it 100, and each time it goes through the loop of creating an object, it will add on to this, and it will just make it easier for moving the objects. Let's close that down. So now what we need to do is tell 3D Studio Max that we want to go through a set number of times and create an object. Now we do that with a for loop. A for loop basically is a loop that will go through a set number of times, and for this time we're going to specify that we want to go from 1 to this. Whatever value is stored in the clone spinner, we want to go through that amount of times. Now to find out how many times we're going to be going through, we'll refer to the internal name of that spinner, clones. We then put a full stop to tell it that whatever comes after the full stop is actually a property of clones. Now the property that we want to access is value. The value stores whatever we've got written in the spinner screen. So if we've got the spinner set to 2, the value is 2. Okay, so we're going to go from 1 to this number. So we're going to go through a block of code this amount of times. So we then want to tell it to do this block of code. So it'll go from 1 to this number doing this block of code. What we then need to do is tell 3D Studio Max what we're going to do that amount of times, and the first obviously thing we're going to do is create an object, either a box or a sphere. Now the way that we're going to find out what to create is with an if statement. An if statement will basically test a value or test an object, and depending on what we get back from that, we'll do a specific event. So if we just go through and write out the first line, if rad buttons, and remember the rad buttons is the radio button object that we can tick either box or sphere, and what we want to test of that is the property state. So we put rad buttons, which is the internal name, a full stop to tell it that we're going to be accessing a property, and then we tell it what property, in this case state. Now state stores an integer, a whole number, and depending on what one of these objects is selected, either the box or the sphere, in the radio buttons depends on that value. So if we have box selected, for instance, it will return 1 because that is the first object, or if we have sphere selected, it will give back the value of 2 because that's the second object that we created in the radio button group. Now the way that we test what the value is with a double equals. The double equals sign means equals 2. So if the state is equal to 1, then we need to create a new object. Now the object that we want to create, if the state of the radio buttons is 1, is a box. Oh, again, I cannot spell. And we need to give the box some parameters. The first parameter that we want to give it is a width. And again, we use the semicolon to tell it that the value that comes after it is what width should be set to. So we'll give it 25, and we'll then tell it that we want to set height to 25, and we want to set length to 30. We can then close that. Okay, so if the state of radio buttons is equal to 1, then do this. But what if we've got sphere selected? We need to tell it what to do if we've selected the second object in the radio button group. An easy way of doing that is with the command else. Else is a part of an if statement. What we're telling 3D Studio Max that is that if state is equal to 1, then do this. Else we'll just go through and do this block of code instead. So if it's equal to 1, then do this, else do this instead. And what we're going to do is create a sphere with a radius of 30. Okay, so if 1, create a sphere, else if it's anything else, if it's 1, create a box, else create a sphere if it's anything else. And you'll notice as I've been going along here, as I've been doing these blocks of code, I've been putting the open and closed brackets straight away. The reason I do that is just to make sure that I don't cause any problems later on by forgetting to put one of those in, either an open or a close. I'm just doing it all at the same time. Okay, so we've created our objects and we're going to be doing it a set amount of times, specified here. We're then going to be creating the objects by testing the state of the radio buttons here and here. Okay, so let's just go through and have a look at that script. Okay, so we can select sphere, we can select 10, we can set them 50 units apart, and we can hit make. Problem you'll notice there is that it's actually created all of the spheres on top of each other. And the reason for that is because we haven't told 3D Studio Max to actually move any of them once we've created them. So if we made some boxes, you'll notice that all the boxes are just piled on top of each other. So what we need to do in the script now is actually tell 3D Studio Max to do something with those boxes or spheres once they've been created. And the way that we'll do that is after the if statement is finished, so the if statement goes from here down to here, we'll move the box or the sphere. And how do we do that? Well, the easy way of doing it is by opening up the maxscript listener, and we'll find out what the command is to actually move anything. And the way that we do this is if we just clear this out, turn on the macro recorder. So just come down here and select it, and if you go back in now, you'll notice a tick next to its name. That means now that as we do things in 3D Studio Max, it will report back to us within here what it's actually doing. So if we go ahead and create a sphere, we'll do it in the front view plane. We'll see that it's given us sphere, radius, with all the options. If we then select the move tool and actually move the sphere, you'll see that it's returned this command, move then a $sign, and then the open and close brace with the three vectors inside the X, Y and Z position that we've moved it to, or the amount that we've moved it by. So now we know that move is the name of the command that we need to use. So we can just delete that. And we'll do move. You'll notice it had the $sign in there. The $sign, when we got it up in the maxscript listener, was to tell it to use this currently selected object. However, we may not have any selected object. So how do we tell 3D Studio Max what to move? Normally you would use the name of the object. However, because we're creating all of these objects, we don't know what their name is. It could be object 5 selected, it could be object 6. The way that we can do that is by creating a temporary variable that will store the name of what we've just created, the box or the sphere. Okay, now to do that we can literally just put new obj equals in front of both of these. And what that does is tells it that once we've created this box, we want to store the name of it here. And that way we can just put new obj here and tell 3D Studio Max that we want to move that object. We then have to open up the brackets and put the X, Y and Z coordinates of how far we want to move it, which is where X offset comes in. Now we need to put X offset in the X value. We'll leave the Y and Z as zeros. Okay, so we're going to create the object and then move it by this distance in the X direction. Now, as I said before, each time this script runs through, we need to increase the value of offset, X offset by the amount specified up here in the distance apart spinner. Now to do that, there are two ways really. There's the longhand way. The longhand is written out like this: X offset is equal to X offset plus, and here we can add on the value of this spinner. So this spinner was called X dist. So we then want to plus X dist dot value. And again, as you remember previously, I said that the full stop means that we're going to be specifying a property. The property that we want to access is value of that spinner. And the value property stores the current value that's written in the spinner. Now that's the longhand way of writing it. However, there is a shorthand way as well, which is to use a different operator called plus equals, and that's literally written as it sounds, plus equals. And then we can put X dist dot value. So what we're telling 3D Studio Max is to add this value onto this value. So X offset will become X offset plus X distance value. Okay, so let's just go through and test the script again. File, evaluate all, and we're presented with the dialog box. We'll select sphere, we'll set them 48 units apart, and we'll create 12. And there you go, we have 12 new objects. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And all from this little bit of code. So as you can see, it's not really a greatly daunting task. The main thing to remember is that when you're going to be looking at creating dialog boxes, using controls and creating objects, to look in the maxscript reference guide, and what it will do is it will give you, of each object you want to create, it will tell you what the constructor name is. This part here, the actual part that tells 3D Studio Max to create an object, is called a constructor. It will then tell you the parameters, such as these, and it will give you a brief example of how to use it. And it does come in handy when you need to do things like this, like actually specify a type of number to actually display within a control that you've created, such as this spinner. Now I hope this script has helped, and what we'll look at in the next video is using maxscript to create a render effect. Okay, so thank you for listening and I hope to see you next time.